Hello and welcome to ExultX Audio Articles podcast. Today, we're discussing one of the most challenging topics in tactical training, musculoskeletal injuries. Discussing this theme in tactical environments often involves navigating complex and emotionally intense issues, shaped by deeply held beliefs and superstitions. Our aim in this episode is to eliminate biases and provide clarity on this intricate topic. The reality is that injuries result from a complex interaction of multiple risk factors, and only a fraction of which have been identified. Taken care. This episode does not claim to offer a universal solution to all the injuries. Instead aims to provide a comprehensive exploration of injuries focusing on their types, risk factors, prevention, rehabilitation, and return to duty models. By examining the unique challenges faced by tactical populations and understanding the factors contributing to injuries, we can develop evidence-based recommendations to mitigate the risk of harm. The significance of addressing injuries in tactical environments extends beyond the well-being of individual personnel. Injuries not only compromise the health and readiness of the affected operator, but can also impact the overall effectiveness of the team or unit. A single injury can lead to a temporary loss of manpower, potentially affecting mission success and the safety of both the operator and their colleagues. Moreover, untreated or mismanaged injuries can contribute to long-term health issues, impacting the during and post-service quality of life. Recognizing the importance of injury prevention and effective rehabilitation is a fundamental aspect of optimizing the performance and longevity of tactical professionals. But before we delve into tactical injuries, we need to clarify some taxonomy. So, when we talk about injuries, we refer to tissue damage or other derangement of typical physical function in the body caused by engagement in sports, exercise, or occupational tasks. This harm typically arises from the rapid or repetitive kinetic energy transfer. These injuries can be classified into two major categories, acute and overuse. In clinical terms, trauma is an injury resulting from the impact of an agent on a specific organism, imparting force and causing damage by subjecting the tissues to forces of tension, compression, or cutting. These are what we call acute injuries, and often result from sudden forceful events and are prevalent in high-risk environments. Examples of the most severe acute injuries in a tactical context include gunshot wounds and explosive-related injuries, both of which have severe consequences, both physically and psychologically. Less severe, more common, yet still significant injuries include bone fractures, muscle contusions, joint dislocations or subluxations, ligament sprains, and tendon tears, among others. On the other hand, overuse injuries result from repetitive stress and strain on specific body parts. These injuries are particularly prevalent in repetitive sports like running, as well as among tactical populations. Over 80% of injuries in tactical populations are overuse, with a significant focus on the knee and lower leg, lumbar spine, ankle, and foot. Examples include stress fractures, joint synovitis, ligament inflammation, focal muscle tissue fibrosis, tendinopathy, fasciopathy, bursitis, and more. Regardless of the type of musculoskeletal injury, the process of tissue healing can be summarized in three phases: the inflammatory response phase, the fibroblastic repair phase, and the maturation remodeling phase. Let's briefly review what happens in each one. The inflammatory phase is the initial response following tissue injury. This phase is characterized by pain, swelling, and redness in the affected area. During this time, the body decreases collagen synthesis, and there is an increase in the number of inflammatory cells that migrate to the injury site. These inflammatory cells are critical for clearing out damaged cells and debris. Additionally, edema or swelling occurs, which can inhibit the contractile function of tissues and limit movement. This phase theoretically lasts for 2 to 3 days after the injury, although it can extend if the blood supply is compromised or the structural damage is more severe. The fibroblastic repair phase is the second stage in the tissue healing process. During this phase, collagen fibers, which are essential for the structural integrity of tissues, begin to be produced. However, the newly produced collagen fibers are not yet well organized, and there is still a reduced number of inflammatory cells as compared to the initial phase. The tissue formed during this phase is weaker than the original tissue, making it susceptible to further injury if not managed properly. This phase marks the beginning of tissue repair, but the tissue is still in a fragile state. The maturation remodeling phase is the final stage of tissue healing. In this phase, the alignment of collagen fibers improves, which enhances the structural integrity and strength of the tissue. As the tissue strengthens, it becomes more functional, although it may not regain the full strength of the original tissue. Despite improvements in collagen fiber alignment and tissue strength, the newly formed tissue remains somewhat weaker than the tissue it has replaced. This phase can continue for an extended period as the tissue gradually remodels and matures. So now we have a simple notion on types of injuries and how our organism repairs them. But why are some people get injured all the time? When it comes to understanding injury risk, there are two main types of factors at play: intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic factors are those internal characteristics that make each of us unique. Think of them as factors within our control to some extent. Things like our muscle strength, flexibility, body composition, and even our genetics. They're part of who we are, and they impact our health, our risk for injury, and how we perform overall. Then there are extrinsic factors, the things that come from outside of us. These could be environmental conditions, like the type of ground you're running on, the weather, or the equipment you're using. Essentially, they're all the outside influences that could affect your body and its performance. Now, while we can categorize risk factors like this, there's still no definitive solution for predicting when and why injuries happen. It's more like assembling pieces of a puzzle, where each piece gives us clues, but not the whole picture. A fascinating model addressing injury risk was developed by Samito and his colleagues. They focused on musculoskeletal injuries in soldiers, but designed their approach to be flexible enough that it could apply to other tactical populations too. In their model, all these intrinsic and extrinsic factors get split into two types: modifiable and non-modifiable. That means some risk factors, like conditioning or the environment, can be adjusted, while others, like age or genetic predispositions, can't be changed. Samito's model further breaks down these factors into 3 levels, or orders of risk, with the third level representing the highest risk factors for injury. This framework is especially useful because it gives us a more structured way to think about risk and identify where to focus prevention efforts, especially in high-stress environments. Another model that's gained attention is Miyawisu's dynamic model of injury. This model looks at how intrinsic and extrinsic factors interact, setting the stage for an injury, but it adds one more essential element: the inciting event. Here's the idea. An operator or athlete can have all these risk factors, let's say tight muscles, uneven terrain, high stress levels. But until there's an actual event, like a sudden twist or impact, an injury doesn't necessarily happen. This event is what Miyawisu calls the injury mechanism. And while it's often the immediate cause of an injury, it doesn't exist in isolation. Both the immediate or proximal factors and those distant or underlying risk factors are crucial pieces to understanding why an injury might occur. Okay, so we know that when intrinsic and extrinsic factors line up the risk of injury spikes, it's the combination of these factors that makes an individual more susceptible. And what's really tricky here is that both types of risk factors can change over time. In fact, they can even shift within a single training session, especially under intense conditions. So how can we manage these risks? According to Bruckner and Kahn, there's a three-tiered approach to injury prevention, with each stage serving a different purpose. Primary prevention is all about stopping injuries before they start. It's proactive, focusing on education, safety rules, and even things like altering the environment to reduce potential risks. For instance, adding better padding in a gym or making sure fields are clear of hazards could be considered primary prevention. Secondary prevention focuses on early detection. This means catching injuries as early as possible, ideally before they become serious. Screening programs and regular health checks are great examples here, along with prompt treatments that can keep a minor issue from turning into something major. Finally, we have tertiary prevention. This is about managing injuries that have already happened. At this point, the goal is to minimize the impact, promote recovery, and ideally prevent any long-term effects. Rehabilitation, physical therapy, reconditioning, and ongoing medical care are key here. Tertiary prevention is really about helping someone bounce back, recover their strength, and reduce the chances of the same injury happening again. When we talk about assessments and screenings in tactical environments, we're essentially talking about tools that help identify vulnerabilities, primarily within intrinsic modifiable factors. These assessments are a form of secondary prevention and are really helpful for spotting weaknesses and making informed decisions about exercise prescriptions. There are different kinds of assessments, which can be divided generally into laboratory tests and field tests. In tactical settings, it is very common to use another classification. We have what's called generic predictive tests, task-related predictive tests, and task simulation tests. Combining these types of assessments regularly allows a better picture of an operator's performance and motor skills, and when done right, this approach can really help track how prepared someone is for critical tasks of his occupation. To pinpoint modifiable risk factors, generic predictive tests are often used, but selecting the right tests depends heavily on available resources, budget, and time constraints. Ideally, you'd want to use a full set of gold standard tests, but in reality, that's rarely possible due to practical limitations. So the goal is to find practical tools that still give valuable insights without breaking the bank or requiring too much time. And here's a tip. If a test doesn't help with decision-making in training or rehabilitation, it's probably not the right tool to use. It is also important to talk about monitoring, which can be a bit trickier in tactical settings because of the unique challenges compared to other fields like sports. While assessments and screenings are relatively well established, monitoring is still somewhat in its early stages. In fact, one of the main reasons why overuse injuries are so common in tactical settings might be due to limited and inconsistent monitoring. Recently, workload monitoring in these environments has gained attention thanks to advances in technology and growing awareness about injury and illness prevention. But there are a few big challenges. Not only do we need to ensure the tools are reliable, but we also have to deal with interpreting the data in real-world situations. This can be particularly challenging if there isn't a sports scientist, exercise physiologist, or medical professional on hand to make sense of it. Despite these hurdles, monitoring is incredibly valuable, serving as both a primary and secondary prevention tool. It helps us track modifiable external factors and see how non-modifiable factors impact operators over time. Gabbett and his team have created a monitoring cycle that could be very useful in tactical settings. This cycle follows a systematic process for interpreting workload data, from the initial exposure to an external training stimulus all the way through subsequent exposures. By following each step in the cycle, it's easier to understand the data, make appropriate training adjustments, and reduce injury risks. Now, let's talk about injury resilience, which is especially relevant given that over 80% of injuries in tactical settings are overuse injuries. So, how can tactical operators improve their resilience? A great approach, especially in physical training sessions, is to start with well-designed warm-up and cool-down routines. Warming up isn't just about getting the muscles ready, it can also be part of a specific injury prevention program. The key here is making sure the warm-up is tailored to the environment and the activity and demands of the fundamental phase of the session. It is also essential that operators know why they're warming up and what benefits they're getting, because buy-in matters. Another crucial guideline is to limit increases in running volume. The general rule is to keep weekly increases below 10%. We know that running is important in tactical training, but sudden large increases in distance significantly raise the risk of injury. Incorporating alternative cardio exercises gives the joints a break from repetitive impact while still building cardiovascular endurance. Exercise variability is another important strategy for building resilience. A training program should include exercises that target strength, mobility, proprioception, multi-axial movements, and neuromuscular control. When combined, these exercises help operators build resilience across multiple facets, preparing them for the unpredictable demands of tactical work. Last but certainly not least is education. Operators should be well informed about recognizing the early signs of overuse injuries and seeking help when needed. Teaching them the importance of proper warm-up and cool-down routines, as well as correct exercise technique, can go a long way in boosting resilience and aiding recovery. Not to mention other variables, such as hydration or nutrition, which can also play key roles here. When we consider all of these factors together, we are left with a clear picture. Operators are better protected when equipped with tools and knowledge tailored to their unique demands. By identifying and managing both intrinsic and extrinsic risk factors, we can make injury resilience programs far more effective, targeting the specific needs and vulnerabilities of each individual. We will also understand that many times when working within a group, there are common vulnerabilities that could be addressed even in a training group session. Naturally, injury resilience is related to injury prevention. The subject of prevention has been studied extensively, and there are some classic models that we can apply here. One of the earliest and most influential is the four-step sequence of prevention, proposed by Van Mechelen in 1992. This model is still widely used today and focuses on a step-by-step process for understanding, preventing, and evaluating injuries. Let's break down the 4 steps. The first step is to understand the scope of the problem by collecting data on injury, incident severity, and types in your population. So here we will answer the question, what types of injuries are most common? Secondly, we need to identify causes and mechanisms behind these injuries, answering questions like, are there specific movements or conditions that make certain injuries more likely? What factors contribute to them? Next, we need to develop and implement strategies based on what you've learned. This might involve new training programs, protective equipment, or education campaigns. Finally, we assess the effectiveness of these strategies, answering questions like, are injuries decreasing? What's working? And what needs to be adjusted? Years later, Caroline Finch expanded this model into what's known as the TRIP model, or translating research into injury prevention practice. This builds on Van Mechelen's work and emphasizes understanding how injury prevention works in the real world. When it comes to tactical roles, one of the most effective frameworks is the Human Performance Optimization Model, or HPO. This is highly adaptable and focuses on injury prevention and performance in high-demand environments. This model focuses on a process of 6 steps, which are injury surveillance, task and demand analysis, predictors of injury and optimal performance, design and validate interventions, program integration, and monitor effectiveness. Despite everything we've already discussed, we understand that injuries will happen. In the tactical world, Rehabilitation is a critical part of returning to duty and achieving long-term injury resilience. Rehabilitation is considered a form of tertiary prevention, aiming to fully restore the operator's functional abilities while preventing further complications. Rehabilitation usually involves several phases, which can vary depending on the type of injury. It's important to move through each phase gradually, without rushing. Skipping steps can lead to re-injury or long-term issues. The ideal approach includes collaboration among specialists like physicians, physiotherapists, strength and conditioning coaches, exercise physiologists, and, of course, the operators themselves. But here's the challenge. Unlike the sports world, where teams often have dedicated sports medicine support, the tactical environment doesn't always offer the same resources or structure. This lack of collaboration can lead to what we call a poor model of rehabilitation, where the medical team or technical coaches don't collaborate fully. This is a missed opportunity for incorporating low-load technical training early on and preparing the operator for duty. In contrast, a well-integrated model brings strength and conditioning coaches, exercise physiologists, and physiotherapists together from the early stages, with technical coaches involved throughout. This way, the operator gradually prepares for tactical performance while recovering. Let's take a look at a comprehensive rehab process. A step-by-step approach is crucial, starting with clinical treatment by medical and physiotherapist, leading to a low-impact movements and progressing to more intense activities as the operator heals. Throughout the process, strength training is crucial in mitigating muscle loss. Correctly understanding and applying the concepts of cross-education, isometric strength training, bilateral deficit, and bilateral facilitation at the right stage of rehab can be essential in accelerating recovery. Nevertheless, throughout this process, it is fundamental that progress is based on a criteria-based approach rather than on time. For example, by monitoring muscle soreness, context-specific agility, and functional tests. This approach helps ensure each phase is completed safely. Reconditioning is the last phase of rehab, which prepares the operator physically and mentally to return to duty. This phase is particularly focused on rebuilding strength, endurance, mobility, agility, and confidence to pre-injury levels. That's why regular application and documentation of screenings, assessments, and tests is so important. Lastly, communication plays a key role. For a successful rehab, all professionals involved, whether from the medical conditioning or tactical side, need to share progress and plans. When these professionals work in different institutions, communication often breaks down, leading to gaps in the rehab process. In these cases, the operator must take the lead, requesting reports and sharing them across the care team. Direct communication would be ideal, but when that's not feasible, providing thorough reports ensures everyone's on the same page and reduces the risk of re-injury. We know that this podcast is already long, but as we said at the beginning, this is one of the most challenging topics to discuss. For those of you who have stayed with us until now, thank you for tuning in. We hope we've contributed to your knowledge on this topic. If you found this episode interesting, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more deep dives into the world of tactical populations. You can also read this information in detail in our written article on our website, ExultX.com. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. Until then, stay fit, stay strong, and stay ready.